The views in this podcast are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent those of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or a recommendation. Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Mark Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Mark Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society.
Today, we're going to be focused on practical market leadership, how markets for clean and green growth are evolving in a volatile economic and geopolitical environment, what that means for leaders in business, government and finance today. The conversation starts from a shared reality. Individual business action alone can't deliver sustainable economies, but governments also can't deliver transitions without active participation from the private sector and from capital providers. So the focus today is on how confidence, coordination, investment and action can be achieved in practice, are being achieved in practice. We've got three brilliant guests joining us today. Helena Norrman is Executive Vice President and Head of Group Communications at SSAB, a steel company working to transform one of the world's most emissions-intensive industries by aligning customers, suppliers, technology, energy systems and regulation. Sang-Hyup Kim is Executive Director of the Global Green Growth Institute, which works with governments to design and deliver green growth strategies and mobilize investment. He brings a policy and geopolitical perspective, including from Asia, and what really enables markets to move at scale. And Marina Grossi is President of Brazil's leading business council for sustainable development, convening major companies to coordinate action across value chains and with government to deliver real-world outcomes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So welcome, everyone. And maybe if we can start with you, Helena. From inside a hard-to-abate industrial value chain, where do you see genuine momentum today? What practical alignments have enabled progress?
Thank you all for this opportunity to talk about a very important topic. I think that where we stand right now, it's not a situation for the faint-hearted. It is a important but very difficult process that companies that are transforming need to take on. And I don't mean to sound too depressing because we are moving forward, but I think it's important to acknowledge the difficulties that companies face in that transformation. Some of the market logic is definitely still there. There is customer demand. We are convinced that there is a market, but we also have very large investments. We have unstable policy frameworks or uncertain policy frameworks, which makes it difficult with large investments, conflicts of interest, especially when it comes to permitting processes. We are a listed company and a financial market that has a substantially shorter time perspective than our investments. All of this would actually make it a lot easier to stop and say that this is not working, but it is also possible to move forward, but it takes a lot of effort.
The fact that the political environment is uncertain at times and deems to, the goalposts move, the framework shift, this creates a lot of uncertainty for long-term strategic planning for industry, and this is the more difficult aspect for the transition. From your perspective, what are the non-negotiables that governments need to get right to enable industrial transition at pace? Where do energy infrastructure planning and permitting matter most? Where would you say is the most important focus from a government point of view?
What is most important is actually predictability. It is very difficult to make large investments, large private investments, in an environment where you're not sure what the rules of engagement will look like. And as we all know, uncertainty is what sort of hampers investments and innovation the most. Certainty is more important than the actual policy areas.
Is this anything the private sector can do more of or start doing that it's not doing that could support the conditions of certainty? Are we just, from a private sector point of view, at the mercy of these geopolitical and socio-cultural phenomena that influence things?
And if I could just jump in there, I wonder if you could also bring this to life a little around the industry that you're in, the business that you're in. Like, where does this show up in really practical terms?
Let's take it from the SSAB perspective. We're a Nordic and US-based steel manufacturer. We all know that steel is a high-emission industry. We have a very ambitious transition or transformation program for our Nordic production system that is still blast furnace-based. The US system is more modern. And this means investing very significant amounts of money. In the Swedish system, where we have made the decisions already, we are investing more than 5 billion euros. And then we have the Finnish system on top of that will come later. And we're doing this in a market where the European steel market is also under a lot of price pressure from cheap imports, especially from Asia, which is not exactly fulfilling the same standards as we're talking about here. We are convinced that it's possible to get to a more sound European steel market. And we're also convinced that there is a market for high quality, low emission specialized steels. We have a strong business case, but it's a business case with large investments over a long time period where you don't get any return on that investment until, if you, like for instance, we're building a new steel mill in the north of Sweden. You have to build the mill before you get any output, which means that it's not kind of a gradual investment. You can't get any payback while you're doing it. So you need to make the upfront investment, and then you start up the new mill, and then you sell the products, and then you get the results. And again, we have strong business cases. The time perspective of the total transformation is between 5 to 10 years, and the financial markets, or sort of the stock market, on a good day with a long-term mindset maybe can stretch to 3 years. So it is, of course, a conflict in that environment. The regulatory uncertainty is leading to question marks from investors, for instance, in terms of how much can we actually control? These are large projects, and large projects always come with uncertainty and, for instance, permitting processes that can be difficult, but maybe more possible to predict. It's a big task, and it's not only us, because again, we are one company. And in order for this to work, you actually need to transform an entire value chain. And it's about everything from a shift in the raw material and the energy that is used in the production. But it's also, of course, a value chain that continues on to our customers and what we actually sell and the price points for that in the market. It's a rather fundamental transformation, but it is one that we believe, A, is necessary for the long-term success of the company, and B, we have a strong business case. And if you can't make the numbers work, you can't do it.
Thank you. So building on that, I'm keen to come to you, Sang-Hyup, and great to see you again. When we last met, you were absolutely being a fire starter in a conversation. You clearly work globally with a whole range of governments. I'm interested in your perspective or input on what kinds of policy interventions are most effective in creating that market confidence. Obviously, predictability, certainty, as we just heard there from Helena, is key. But beyond that, what kinds of interventions do you see? Are there specific examples that you would highlight?
As Helena rightly pointed out, the biggest enemy of securing big and long-lasting investment is uncertainty and unpredictability. And that is what we see these days. So to secure certainty and predictability, the role of government is very important. And also international cooperation is essential. And in that regard, it's a pity to see that the withdrawal or retreat from the UN system of the United States is not a good news. But as for the role of government, defining green and clean transition in a fundamental way is very important. It is not just about environmental policy. It is about industrial policy. It is about energy, technology, and finance and investment policy. It is about human resources policy. What I'm trying to say, it should be defined as the new set of interest of nations by having nationwide top-level approaches. Korea tried to do that when it announced green growth as its new national development paradigm in the year 2008. But just 1 month after that, the so-called global financial crisis came in. But Korea didn't retreat from the crisis. Korea introduced more than $40 billion size Green New Deal measures. It's about the investment in the future. So that's how Korea could strengthen the water infrastructure in a more resilient way. That's how Korea could develop electric vehicles and batteries and future-oriented energy system. China will pursue its way of green growth. And actually, in 2012, when he became the president of China, President Xi Jinping pursued the green development, slightly different name, under the big theme of ecological civilization and green development. And they persistently invested green technologies such as electric vehicle, battery, and solar PV, and now wind power. And that shows how the definition of the transition matters that much, because China did that for the sake of the Chinese interest that could be aligned with the global direction. And that's how they can attract many stakeholders' involvement. And also, US tried to do that. Last year at the APEC summit that was hosted by Korea, we held a special session on High Ambition Coalition on climate change, which includes energy transition and decarbonization, including greening, steelmaking, etc., and then carbon market. So we do need real global cooperation system more than ever. So the role of international organization is increasing while we see the difficulties of UN system at this moment.
Thank you. And it's really valuable to have the reality of China's approach and story, which has certainly changed. Much of my time is with corporate boards and executives who are often saying, why would we act because China isn't, and point only to the coal story around China and China's emissions. But that story is clearly changing rapidly, and those same businesses in Europe are now being outcompeted by innovation from China that's not just cheaper, but increasingly superior technology. And so that competitive pressure in Europe is from China and Asia more widely is growing. So given that you work globally, I'm interested in your view practically about what would your advice be to European policymakers, to European businesses who are sitting in this geopolitical or geoeconomic tensions that we're sitting in. There's a need, as you say, for international cooperation, but this is also incredibly competitive.
As I said, a like-minded coalition is truly important. At this juncture, EU needs to work closely with Asia, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN countries, because that's how you can scale up the opportunities by working each other. And GGI is providing a platform for that kind of mutual cooperation. As I mentioned, the case of the CJK ASEAN Climate Cooperation special session that was held in an APEC summit, we try to combine the competitive edge of each countries to bring about mutual cooperation, especially in carbon market. Korea introduced the emission trading system for the first time in Asia in 2015, and China followed Korea's pathway 2 years later by introducing nationwide emission trading scheme. And now Japan is introducing nationwide emission trading scheme. So for those three countries alone, the carbon emission account for more than 30%. When we count in those ASEAN countries, more than 40%. And Indonesia and Vietnam is respectively introducing carbon market system. But the problem of Asian carbon market is fragmentation. They do not work each other. So if we can increase linkage among heterogeneous carbon market, we can encourage collective efforts when it comes to green transition.
Thank you for those specific examples, really helpful. Before we turn to Marina's perspective, I'm keen to know whether, Helena or Marina, you've got any response to that broad call for greater collaboration, obviously acknowledging some of the geopolitics, a changing story around China and Asia.
From a company perspective, it is about sort of policy and international policy predictability. I think the geopolitical dimensions are outside of the control of any commercial organization. So that is something that as companies, we have to be flexible enough to be able to deal with different situations that occur. But it's clearly sort of government responsibilities to manage and to handle. And also the big policy questions are government responsibilities. And back to the question that you asked before, Mark, about what can companies do? I mean, companies can voice. Policymakers are very clear on that companies should voice, but we can't control. It's outside of our sphere of control. I also very much, of course, agree on the collaboration side and the teaming up side. And again, it is about value chains. It's not about markets really, because most companies operate in international environments and cross borders, and the fragmented landscape when it comes to carbon markets, for instance, is also, of course, a challenge in this respect. From a company perspective, there isn't our asks for government and our asks for cross sort of international collaboration are, of course, very extensive.
Marina, if we can ask you to come in here, obviously with the lens on Brazil, I was wondering, the extent to which you could give some concrete examples where coordinated business action in Brazil, either across the value chain or with government, has delivered tangible outcomes.
Thank you. It's a very great pleasure to be here with you after COP, after all those movements in the world, to talk about this important topic. Here in Brazil, we just came out from the COP30, so it was a big achievement. We fortunately could put together more than 197 countries to deliver practical things. So we have the frame globally to move ahead. And Helen was talking about predictability. We need that for a go ahead, and also for carbon market. There was a very big achievement that we came out from this COP, the regulatory carbon market for all over the world. So that's a big achievement. And if you're thinking that sustainability nowadays is about competitiveness, that's a very important issue to move on. Let me just highlight some of the attributes of Brazil. We are clean. We're very clean. We have almost 0.5% of our energy metrics is clean, is from renewable. On electricity, we are about 90% of our electricity is renewable. But let me jump in the question here. And I think when market moves, it's heavily because of a single policy or two. It's about an orchestration. And that's what I think we have to, and that's what Brazilian Business Council, that we call SEBEDES in Portuguese, that has 120 big companies. They are trying to give, as a business platform, to give inputs for the government to build more concrete policies to move forward. As a business platform, I think that partnership between government and private sector is very key. Brazil offers a very strong example with this ecological transformation plan. It's our Green Deal that makes it effective. What makes it effective was the coordination, align policy, finance, and industry around clear pathways. Regulatory carbon markets, blended finance instruments, and sector-specific transition plans reduce uncertainty and unlock private capital. We all know that. Brazilian Business Council, we had similar dynamics emerging through pre-competitive coalitions. And I think you mentioned before coalitions, and I think that's something very key in nowadays to move forward. So we made sectoral decarbonization coalitions that brought hundreds of companies together across transport, power, agriculture, and mine. Instead of competing on ambition, we align on science pathways and implementation, which gave credibility with investors and policymakers. So credibility comes from delivery. So we made initiatives like the Brazil of Solutions with many cases from our companies. And we didn't announce a new pledges, but we showcases projects already working and connected them to the capital. So the challenge today, it's not a lack of ideas, it's a scale up what we have already on the ground.
Based on that experience, where do you see the greatest agency for businesses today? If you were, for example, in a business to be able to take up the challenge, where is the greatest opportunity from a business point of view, in your opinion?
First, we have to rebuild confidence by showing outcomes, not just targets, any company. So transparency, solid data, local partnerships really matters, especially in regions facing political or social backlash. Second, coordinate across value chains. We all mentioned here about value chains, align demand signals, long-term offtake, finance, and technical support, so that the smaller producers aren't forced to carry all the risk of transition. So blended finance is a key for this transition. Third, engage constructively with the political economic, helping shape enabling policy with evidence and implementation experience is far more effective in reacting defensively once regulation arrives. Fourth, build capabilities for speed and scale. That means sharing infrastructure for data and measurement, reporting, and verifications with a stronger governance, and leadership willing to make long-term decisions under uncertainty. We are already seeing some of those examples in practices, sectorial roadmaps moving into execution, scale investment in bioeconomy and regenerative agriculture, adoption of new transparency standards, and more robust carbon strategies aligned with national systems. So platforms like the Landscape Accelerator Brazil show how this work on the ground, pooling capital, aligning metrics, reducing risk, and scale impact faster together than alone.
I also attended the COP30 held in Belém, Brazil, and there was a very memorable moment in regard of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. There in Belém, Norway and Indonesia made a kind of potential agreement on the mitigation outcome purchase agreement, which is about 12 million CO2 reduction. That was facilitated by GGGI. So by taking fully advantage of the Article 6, which is about internationally mitigation transferring outcome efforts, we can find new opportunities. So one deal, that is the largest deal that is going to happen. The final deal needs to be made for a few months. I told the Simon Steele, the head of the UNFCCC, by working together, we are making new opportunities. And in that regard, Brazil provided a very nice platform. I really appreciate the leadership role taken by Brazil.
So then if we turn to leadership, then a lot of the leaders we're working with, a lot of the businesses that we're working with are genuinely struggling with, as you highlighted, Marina, that a lack of confidence. The story hasn't played out as they hoped for some of the reasons that you highlighted around the US pullout and so on, and how that's changed markets' assumptions about this story of transition. We also see a lack of confidence around business agency. I think somewhat to your point, Helena, like what can we do around geopolitics? These are bigger forces than us. So I'm interested then in your views on leadership. Where do leaders have agency now, both in the public and in the private sector? You've talked, Marina, about building confidence through a focus on outcomes. You've talked about showcasing, highlighting what works to build market momentum and to enable solutions to attract capital. But really, where would you be pinpointing where the agency lies right now? Perhaps start with you again, Helena, sitting in business.
I think the leadership challenge is very interesting right now, because if we go back a couple of years, it was very much the aspirational leadership. It was the big visions, the big ideas. And now we're in a very different place, and it's a different leadership that is needed. I think it's a very pragmatic and very business-oriented leadership that can actually make things happen. But it needs to be a pragmatic and business-oriented leadership that still has the ambition. I'm not talking about sort of short-term pulling back and looking at the next quarter, because that's obviously not going to transform anything. But it's a combination of super pragmatic business numbers, operational excellence driven leadership, because that can actually generate strong enough results to allow for the transformation to happen. And then you need to stay the course, and that takes guts. It's a combination of capabilities, but it's a very different leader, I think, than we had a few years ago that will be successful in this phase.
Marina, is there anything more that you would add? You already gave a rich set of insights on where business agency lies, but if you were applying a leadership lens on that and advice to leaders at this point in time, what would you be highlighting?
Of course, we have to treat planetary boundaries as hard economic constraints. I think climate, biodiversity, water risks are not externalities anymore. They are redefining competitiveness. So ignoring them exposes companies to supply chain disruption, regulatory shocks, and loss of social license. Companies underestimating their interdependence. So markets don't shift because one leader moves first. They shift when coalitions align incentives across value chains, sectors, and jurisdictions, which is exactly what coordinated carbon markets and sharing standards matters. So we have to think shaping markets means recognizing that competitiveness is in the next decade will be defined by the ability to operate within planetary boundaries, create shared value, and collaborate at scale. The companies that understand this will be more able to manage risk. They can also define how will be the markets in the future. And I think COP30 gave us some frame for that. It was a big achievement in nowadays, but of course that's a turbulent period of time. And I think the voice of private sector has a key role to play on this, because we think long term, not in short term. Helen and all of you was mentioned that. We are the ones that has to give inputs and try to push with the voice of institutions like mine, but there are some others, of course, that combines the voice of private sector. So we can really pressure and show that we are ready for scale up, but we need some regulatory framework and more predictability.
As Marina said, coalition is truly important. And if global universal multilateralism is not easy to achieve, then we can start with mini multilateralism by working with like-minded countries together. While the world sees rather unilateral power-struggling geopolitical conflict, the global green economy is growing. According to the recent report published by the Boston Consulting Group, the green economy is now more than $5 trillion economy, and it will be more than $7 trillion. And if we can scale up our cooperation with like-minded countries, it can go up much higher. It is true there are two forces contradicting with each other. One is unilateral self-serving interest. Another one is cooperative approach that is forging another opportunities to my eyes. Encouraging kind of small, rather mini multilateral coalition can be helpful in this time.
Thank you very much. Bringing us to a close, it would be useful, given that we've really focused on the importance of collective leadership, if you like. A lot of the magic that we're looking for comes from cooperation across institutions, governments, businesses, sectors. And that obviously is the right way and brings about the possibilities we hope for. But if you're an individual leader sitting in an individual institution or company, what is the kind of capability or capacity in an individual that you would say is most important right now, given the complexity of the challenge that we've spent the whole time outlining? What advice would you give a single individual leader right now from an agency point of view who really does want to participate in the transition? And maybe we could just take an insight from each of you as a kind of closing comment.
To pursue a green and clean and transition, we must have a transformative leadership. Transformative leadership should be with direction, clarity, and a long-term vision. If we can connect transformative leaders around the world, we can achieve something great. And another thing is we must take advantage of AI. AI is now everywhere. AI is coming with a climate solution. AI is now forecasting extreme weathers. AI is now optimizing renewable power generation and maximizing the efficiency of power grid. And as is the case of carbon transaction, AI is providing robust, smart, and innovative MRB system, measurable, reportable, verifiable system, which is enhancing credibility and integrity. So we must take advantage of new technologies in a better way by working with each other, by setting certain standards, by encouraging transparency, by pursuing sustainability.
Thank you very much, Sang-Hyup. Helena, over to you.
Yeah, so 3 things, and none of them are new, but I think that these dimensions are more important than normal. First of all, ability to focus and prioritize. There are lots of trade-offs that you need to make if you want to make big transformative investments. Second, an ability to manage uncertainty without becoming paralyzed, because it's very easy so that you stop making decisions because you really don't know what's happening. That doesn't work. You don't know what's happening, but you still have to move forward. And third, the old leadership paradox of managing the short term and the long term. You can't choose. You have to manage both, and you need to decide your balance.
And Marina, if you can give us your insights for our last comment. Thank you.
The leadership is the one that believes that incremental improvements inside the business as usual model is not enough. The efficient games and pilot projects alone, they won't deliver anything substantial. So we mentioned coalitions, and I think pre-competitive coalitions, putting together sectors on private sector, that would be a key thing to really move more uncertainty. And I agree with Helen to prioritize our targets, our goals. We also put a lot of small efforts in a lot of things. So let's prioritize what really moves the things. If that's what moves a half or more than a half of one sector, let's put this. We made this on our coalitions. We said, well, how to deliver net zero by 2050 for each sector that we work with. But what are the 3 key areas or actions that we have to do? So if you face this and try to face on those 2 or 3 areas and put together the private sector, I think that would be much more effective.
GGI is now focusing on 3 things: carbon market, AI, and clean energy system. If we can work together on these 3 things, then we can stand together. If divided, we fall. If united, we will win. Let's start some doable things together first by making coalition together.
Thank you. And hearing strong agreement there from Marina too. Thank you so much for so many rich insights in such a short time. Really important that in spite of that challenging context, the challenging leadership context that Helena opened on, the green transition has been remarkably resilient. It is unstoppable. It's just a question of accelerating it. It's a question of timing, not whether it's happening, for sure. And we've heard really clearly that incrementalism isn't going to be enough, and everyone just doing their own thing in their own channel isn't going to be enough. We need to get big stuff done rapidly. I've also heard this need to really recognize hard boundaries. These are not just, in the space of science and environment. They are relevant to the shape of future markets and access to resources. That importance of having long-term vision, but delivering in the short term too. As Helen said, you don't get to choose. And as Marina said, you have to show those near-term outcomes, not just pledges. But they need to be super pragmatic and prioritized. But across all of you, I've also heard this need for pre-competitive coalitions, whether that's with businesses in their own sectors, in their own value chains, or whether that's at national level. So I want to thank you. Thank you, Helena, for your leadership insights and the work that your business is doing to really push the boundaries of innovation and getting things done in a really challenging sector, but also to Marina and to the work that you're doing at the Global Green Growth Institute to build those platforms to enable those critical coalitions to happen. Without the work of those facilitators and conveners, that work wouldn't happen. So thank you. Join us next time for What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Mark Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.